Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
Before we do kick this off, we wanted to acknowledge the passing of Dikembe Mutombo, NBA legend. He passed away at age 58 from brain cancer. Really unfortunate series of events and all that stuff. So we are sending prayers to his family and friends in this tragic time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the giants of the NBA and a guy that was really, pivotal to expanding the game internationally, right, overseas in Africa. Also, his great humanitarian efforts, including building hospitals in his native country of the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? So just a larger than life figure, great personality, and a guy that will definitely be missed. A lot of players and a lot of people around the NBA have brought that up, so we wanted to bring that up too.
Yeah, crazy icon. Comment your favorite moment of Mutombo's career, all that stuff. I could just remember the whole. I think it was the All-Star game. Banter
Mhm.
between him and Jordan. I think that was probably one of my favorite moments.
And then, of course, everybody always remembers when they eliminated the one seed Supersonics from the
Mm-hmm.
playoffs. They were one of the first 8 seeds to upset a one seed, and he was on the floor with the ball. Obviously, super elated and super emotional over that, and it was a great accomplishment. So, he'll be missed. So hopefully, hopefully rest in peace to Dikembe Mutombo. After that, now we will get into the next team of our offseason review, and it's the Portland Trailblazers. And obviously, the Portland Trailblazers didn't have as busy of an offseason this time around, but obviously that was because they did a vast majority of their work in the previous offseason, right? Where obviously they traded away Damian Lillard, they grabbed Robert Williams, right? They also grabbed DeAndre Ayton, and they also, drafted guys like Shaden Sharp, not Shaden Sharp, my bad, Scoot Henderson, as well as Chris Murray and others. But this offseason, they did things a little bit differently. Instead, they ended up trading for a veteran, right? Or I guess, a veteran in that he's been in the league for a little bit, but it's still a relatively young guy, right? They
Mm-hmm.
ended up trading Malcolm Brogdon away, as well as the pick that became Bub Carrington, and I think a future pick in the draft for Denny Avdia, right? Denny Avdia coming over from the Washington Wizards, as you know, right? That's your team. And, he's a guy that's a pretty versatile forward, right? Pretty good defender, right? Improved offensive player, but not necessarily a quote unquote scorer. But he did have, his best offensive year last season, right? He averaged just under 15 points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists, 51 from the field, 37 from three. And that's big for him because, the previous seasons before that, he was shooting around 30% from three. So if that 3 point percentage is improved, right, and his efficiency is up, and the rebounding and playmaking is up again, that's where you can get a really good player on a really good contract because his contract goes down annually, right? I mean, you look at his contract and it's like 15 million, 14, 13, and then 12 at the end of it in 2027, 2028 by the time he's 27, and he could continue to get better. So they got back, I guess the best player in that deal. And, again, that's a pretty decent return in terms of swapping Malcolm Brogdon with Denny Avdia, because I don't think that was necessarily expected, right? Brogdon was a guy whose name popped up at the deadline last year. And, most of the names that were coming up were kind of like, basically guys that I guess are kind of like in a similar tier, but worse, and I think a little bit older, right? Like some people were like, well, what about say like LA if they, trade, I don't know, like a Rui or somebody like that for Malcolm Brogdon or, something along those lines. But, for Portland, again, you got a lot out of the Lillard deal because it basically netted you DeAndre Ayton, Robert Williams, Denny Avdia. I mean, like that's a lot of that's a pretty solid group of young guys.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously that doesn't even include the guys that they had already flipped, which I had mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, you know, that's a good deal, I think, for both teams, because I think we talked about it at the time where we liked it for both teams. I know some people didn't necessarily really like it for the Wizards because, understandably, you're letting go of a good young player that's on a decent contract. But, I think he's probably at a point where maybe you might like to put him on a team that's a little bit further along. And so that may just kind of be better for both sides because I'm sure he'll play a lot in Portland Although I'm curious as to what the rotation will be, and we'll see. But obviously for the Wizards, right? They're going all in on their tanking and youth movement, and not that Portland isn't, but their roster is a little bit different in terms of how it's constructed compared to Washington's, right? But we'll see what happens. But it's a good deal for Portland. And then the other move they made in the draft was bringing in Donovan Clingan, right? Obviously that was the other massive 7-footer in the draft, right? Coming from UConn, right? Who won back-to-back titles, right? And so for him, right? He's a big guy, 7'3", close to 300. A guy that can block shots, rebound, right? Kind of like, I guess, sort of like a throwback-ish type center, but not as much of a post scorer as, say, like a Zach Edey, right? More so like a guy that's like screen setter, roller to the rim. We assume that's what his role will be in the NBA. In the summer league, he tried to take some threes, so I don't necessarily know if that means that he's trying to also grow his offensive game as a floor spacer. I don't know, because I mean I guess in summer league it's nice to be able to try a lot of different things. I just don't necessarily know if right off the bat will he actually be able to shoot threes at a decent clip for a big man. I don't know, but I think ideally you'd like to get some of those other skill sets down first. But obviously it's a guy where he played in a lot of big college games, right? He's not a 19-year-old. He is 20. He'll be 21 as the season goes on. So, it seems like it's a good pick. And obviously he was a guy that a lot of teams wanted, right? Like Memphis tried to trade up in the draft to get him, right? Of course, a lot of other teams were looking for centers. It's a cheap option at the 5 spot. So we'll see what his career looks like. But the main thing that's going to be tough for him is, when you look at the rotation in the front court, that's where it's going to be interesting to see where he gets those minutes, because of the fact that Portland has a lot of guards and a lot of bigs, right? And that's kind of one of the issues with this roster, even though they made some solid moves this offseason. When you look at the front court for, ahead of Donovan Clingan, you have DeAndre Ayton, right? And you have Robert Williams. Those are two guys that are primarily centers. And they're guys that at this point in their careers right now are better than Donovan Clingan. So presumably they're going to either both start or both get decent amount of minutes.
Mhm.
Then you also have Jeremy Grant, right? Who's basically, a forward. Then you also just grabbed Denny Avdia. So, that's already basically 4 guys in the front court, that are going to presumably play more minutes than Donovan Clingan. So I'm curious to see how that really works, if it even really works at all. And that's not even including some of the other wing guys that they have that at some point maybe they'll try to play, guys like Tamani Kamara, Jabari Walker, Chris Murray, right? Even like a Matisse Thybulle can sometimes occasionally play the wing spot. So it's a little bit of a cluster at that front court spot. And then even at the guard spot, right? You look at the fact that you got Scoot Henderson, Anthony Simons, and Shaden Sharp, and they're basically all guards, right? Scoot's a point guard, Simons is kind of a combo guard, and then Sharp is a 2 guard. So, I mean, that's kind of a cluster right there as well. And it's kind of tough to envision a world where all 3 of them in the future all start and play together, because none of them are necessarily great defensive guys. So that's kind of an issue there. So it feels like at a certain point, you're probably going to have to decide between, 1 or 2 of those 3. Who knows which one that is? I mean, Simons is the one that's already getting paid, so it could be him, but you don't necessarily know, right? And then with Scoot, obviously, that's the guy that they drafted last year, who everybody was pretty high on, and his rookie season started off pretty rough. It got better as the season went along, but I think it was a little bit surprising, how rough it did look initially early on, right? Because, obviously that was kind of the debate of the draft, right? Was who do you take at number 2, Scoot Henderson and Brandon Miller? And, there was a big gap in terms of which guy looked like the more ready guy, right? Going into their rookie seasons, which, we both talked about, because you had Miller at 2 and I had Scoot at 3, but I think we both acknowledged that Miller was going to be, the more ready guy coming out of college, just because of his skill set and because of his size. So Scoot, he's going to need a little bit more time to kind of show if he's got it or not, right? Obviously, it's just 1 year in the NBA. And again, to be fair, if you look at his splits over the course of the season, they did get better, right? But also, like, it was pretty awful in the beginning of the season.
It was
but
historically
at least
bad.
I guess, yeah. But I guess at least you can say, there's nowhere to go but up, hopefully. But also, like, there was a level of growth over the course of the year, right? Because, like, if you look at his numbers in October, right, first 4 games, 8 points, 3 rebounds, 4 assists.
Right.
Then 8 points, 2 rebounds, 4.5 assists,
Right.
33 from the field. Very bad from three. I'm not even really going to say it, but his true shooting percentages were, you know, around 40%. 37 in October, 42.5 in November, which is bad, right? That's like you said, historically awful. And that's not even, that doesn't even include the turnovers, right? It was a lot of turnovers. Basically like 3-4 a game. And then once you got to December, 15, 3 and 5, January 12, 3 and 4, and then in February 18, 4 and 6, right? And then you had March, right, 15, 5, 4 and 5, and then in April 19 and 10. So, overall, right, the last month of the season, those 7 games was his best by far production of that season, right? He shot well from 3, didn't shoot that well from the field, but he did shoot well from 3 and got a lot of assists. So, but again, to be fair, Portland wasn't playing for anything, and their roster overall is kind of messy. But I think at the very least, you do like to see that on a month by month basis. He was improving, and I think that's where you kind of hope that in year 2, right? Now you've added a little bit more, I guess, NBA ready talent, right? In Denny Avdia, we'll see what Klingon looks like, right? Maybe that also helps Scoot, and hopefully he continues to grow and evolve as well as a scorer, decision maker, defender, right? Because we talked about it when the season was going on, right? That the point guard spot is a very tough position to learn and transition into in the NBA because you're effectively running the team's offense, right? And even though he's got some great physical gifts, right? Obviously, the main question was the skill level, right? What the skill elements? How does that translate into the NBA? And again, he looked good in the summer league, but he still has some room to grow on that end, right? Simons right now is probably the most developed guard at this point. He's the best of those 3. Shaedon Sharp's got some decent qualities about him, right? He's a good athlete, good scorer. Last year he didn't shoot quite as well from 3, but again, the roster was a little bit messy, right? Like his numbers went up, but his efficiency dropped from year 1 to year 2. So that's not ideal. But also to be fair, right? He only played in 32 games, right? Because he had an injury, and a lot of the guys on the roster had a tough time staying on the floor. Unfortunately for the Portland Trailblazers. Now again, they were also kind of tanking, so that probably plays into it as well. But I mean, you look, Anthony Simons only 46 games, Shaedon Sharp only 32 games. Scoot Henderson played the most of those guys at 62, right? But the funny thing is that he really played the most games of any of their main rotational guys, because even DeAndre Ayton only played in 55. Robert Williams only played in 6. So, a lot of key guys that they were probably hoping to get something out of didn't play. Jeremy Grant only played in 54 games, right? So, and I mean, just kind of a lot of missed time from a lot of these guys. Again, I still don't really expect the team to really be that great. But I think the main question for me is that there's no way that all these guys can realistically long term be on the roster together, right? It's a mix of some veterans and a decent amount of young players. And it'd be nice to kind of see if some of those young players should actually be, realistically rotational pieces. And there's no way to actually play all of them because you're going to have to give minutes to at least some of these vets, right? Because like guys like DeAndre Ayton and Jeremy Grant and Avdia and Robert Williams, they are good players. So those guys do have to play and actually get minutes. But then you also have guys like Scoot who needs to develop, Shaedon who needs to develop, right? Some of the other forwards like a Chris Murray or Rayon Rupert, right? Maybe they need to develop, and maybe some of those guys just won't really be that good. But it'd be nice to see what kind of opportunities they're going to get this season. Even a guy like a Matisse Thybulle's a veteran, so there's a lot of players on this roster. It's just again, obviously at the top, you don't really have a great player at this point, so it'd be pretty tough for me to envision them really being that great. But I think in terms of what they were able to do, like I didn't expect them to get Denny Avdia. Like
Right.
that's a solid grab because that could be a guy that's young enough to either be an NBA ready guy right now, or a few years from now, he could still be one of their core guys. And that's a
Right.
guy that does do some things that Portland needs because they need a lot of defense. They already have a lot of, good offensive players or decent offensive players, but Avdia is a guy that can play on the other end of the floor as well, and he's long. So, I mean, that's something that you would like to see there. And then the Klingon pick, right? It seems like a good pick. It's just I have no idea how much he'll play, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it'll even look like. So that's kind of the question there, but I don't really have an issue with the pick. I mean, this was one of the teams where I think, I kind of projected him around this range. I think I had him maybe like a pick earlier or two,
Hmm.
but either way, it's not really a problem. It's just a matter of if you're Portland. I'm just curious to see. I feel like this should be one of those teams that should probably be active at the deadline, not in terms of acquiring guys, but in terms of selling some of these guys. If they can find a way to move off of some of these other players, that would, I think, be, pretty helpful to a lot of these other guys, just, and also like you might be able to get an asset or two from some of these players. I don't expect them to get a ton for everybody. I mean, I don't even really expect them to get a lot for any of these players, but I just feel like these guys are probably better. Some of these guys are probably just better served being on more, good teams as opposed to a team like Portland, right? Like, say like a guy like a Robert Williams was a starting player for an NBA Finals team, right? Honestly, DeAndre Ayton was as well, even though, both of their values have kind of dropped off. Williams because of his health, and then Ayton, just his level of production has been kind of up and down at different points. Even though, the latter part of last season he was good, the beginning part was a little bit different. But either way, that's kind of where I would hope, that Portland would kind of explore some moves, because otherwise it just feels like a very jumbled up, kind of clustered up roster. So it's something that I think that they should explore, but I do think that I would give them a B plus for what they were able to do, because I do like the Avdia pickup and trade, and I do like the Donovan Clingan draft pick. I just wish that they had been able to kind of clear up the roster a little more going into the season. But, if they can do it at the deadline or maybe next offseason, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just, just like whatever position you can put your young players, whatever the best position you can put them in to succeed, I think is kind of the path you should go forward with. Because it's just 4 or 5 years from now, do I expect like Robert Williams, DeAndre Ayton, and Jeremy Grant to be like key pieces of this roster? Not necessarily.
Yeah, I have to agree with pretty much everything that you said. I would give them a B for this offseason. A lot to like, I think. It's one of those off seasons that I think is, I'm kind of grading it based on the future ramifications more so than the here and now, because
Yeah.
with Avdia, yeah, that could easily be a core guy, like you said. He pretty much fits their timeline. He fits the same timeline as Shaden Sharp, Scoot. So that's good, and it gives you stability at that wing position, because before it was either Chris Murray, Kamara, like I don't know, it was just like a weird rotation that they had going on there. So and the cool thing about Avdia is he doesn't miss time that much. Through 3 seasons I think he played like 70 games. So that's pretty cool. In each one of those seasons he played like 70 plus games. So pretty dope. And then, Klingon, I think that's the interesting one, because I think that's more of like an insurance policy. Like, once we move on from Aiton or Robert Williams, we have our center of the future, and that's pretty cool. And I think he'll fit pretty well with Scoot, because I feel like Scoot, if he can just develop that elite playmaking aspect to his game, then I think he'll be a decent, serviceable guy. I don't know if he'll be the franchise guy. I think he still has that burden of kind of being projected as that. And you look at the numbers, like you said, nothing too eye popping, but they did start trending upwards towards the end. But I think him and Klingon will be like a good duo to have as well. And then Shaden Sharp, I think if he can develop the outside shot, Avdia continue to shoot well as well, and the contract is great, fits the timeline. So overall, I like what they did. I don't necessarily like maybe giving up 2 first-round picks for Avdia. I think 1 would have sufficed, but the Wizards, they probably wanted, a little bit more, and that's what they got. So, pretty neutral on that trade, but, it kind of, there's not a whole lot to say here, because they didn't move guys like DeAndre Ayton or Robert Williams. But to get off of Malcolm Brogdon was for sure an absolute W, because, I mean, that guard room was already stacked, and, adding in a vet is cool and all, but you already had Simon, so that's kind of how I feel about it. So B for me. Like I said, I think Avdia will fit into the rotation very well. I think he starts. I think the starting lineup would be some combination of probably Scoot. Yeah, the 2 guard is the tough one. Probably Simons. I think Simons is a little bit further along than Shaden Sharp. You also look at the money as well. I think Simon starts at the 2. Probably start Denny at the 3. At the 4, Grant. At the 5, you have to start Ayton. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what I would look at. But the
Yeah,
cool
and
thing is you have flexibility. So
and last season, Simon started in all 46 games he played.
there you go.
Jeremy Grant started in all 54 games. Ayton started in all 55. And then Shaden Sharp started in 32 out of 25. And Scoot Henderson only started half the season, basically 32 out of 62. But that was because I think he started it as a starter, right? Then
Yeah,
he got
yeah.
demoted to the second unit.
Yeah,
Then
and
as
then there was
guys,
injuries or whatever.
yeah. And then once he came back and everybody else was just gone, then obviously he got back into the starting lineup.
If he's
So,
not starting this season, then I'm concerned. Just
yeah,
keeping it
because I
real.
feel like that's your number 2, 3 pick, I guess, basically. So I mean, you kind of have to, I think, at this point.
Bro, he was
But
supposed to
that
get the keys to the franchise, after Dame leaving. Like, we expected
right,
him to have an explosive historical rookie season, and that didn't
and
happen.
that's the
It
and
was
that's the tough.
explosive, all right, but not the good kind.
Yeah, and that's the tough part is the fact that you have all those guards in the rotation because I mean those are basically 3 of your 4 or 5 best players, I guess, kind of. So I mean, and all of them are good enough that in theory they should start on a team like this, but they can't actually all start together, just because of all the other pieces. And that's where you kind of wonder, like, not now, but say like down the line, is there a world where one of those guys is moved off of? Like it could you see Portland, like say next offseason, moving any of those 3 players?
Yeah, I would say Simons. I don't think
Yep.
they're going to move on from Shaden Sharp too quick. I think the normal
Mhm.
kind of course that we see people take is either year 3 they get moved on from, or year 4
Yeah.
after the
Yeah.
extension or whatever. So,
Mhm.
yeah, and I think he's shown like a lot of promise to the point where not untouchable, but I think he for sure is still within the timeline. Simons though, that's the one where I'm like, I don't know, because it's been what? He's been in the league since 2018. So,
Well, yeah, because he's already on a pretty sizable deal, so you almost kind of wonder if there's like another okay team that may be like, well, we couldn't get anybody, let's trade for Anthony Simons, and
yeah.
he's not even old at all. It's just he's 20, 4 or 5 or
Yeah.
whatever, while Scoot and Shaden Sharp are basically 20 and 21.
Yeah.
So
I just feel like he's like the one, not necessarily with the most value, but he's the one that you know what you're going to get with him, if that makes
like
sense. And I
right
think
now, he's the
that's
best
more
of the
certain.
3.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Which, my opinion, probably isn't a good thing for Portland if we're keeping it
Mhm.
real, because how far
Mhm.
can, a team go where it's led by Simons? And it's not that he's bad or anything like that. It's just like, does that translate
Yeah.
to winning basketball? I feel like he needs to be surrounded by a bunch of
Mhm.
talent that's way better than him.
Yeah. So if we were to rank, I guess, the top 3 trade candidates for this team,
Mm-hmm.
like what would it be? Like in terms of like which guy on this roster is the guy that you would, if you're Portland, want to try to trade the most, and
Mm-hmm.
then the second and third after that one.
Yeah, I feel like you could tackle it from a bunch of different angles. Like, you could probably say Robert Williams is probably one that you would want to trade just because his health is always in question.
Mhm.
Then you also have DeAndre Ayton as well, and to be honest, Ayton looked interesting in the
Mhm.
games that he played. I think he looked
Yeah.
a little bit better than I thought he would.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Towards the end.
yeah. So, but I don't know. I think he's also another guy that could be moved on from, just considering that you did freaking draft Klingon. So that tells me one of these centers has got to go. And then Simons. Those would probably be the top 3. And I would probably say Robert Williams number 1 if I'm keeping it real.
Mhm. Yeah. And then I guess, Grant is on that list as well,
Oh
but I
yeah.
think the issue is that his contract
Yeah.
is a little bit different. Because say like with Ayton, he's got the biggest contract, but then it's only 1 year after this year. So in
Right.
theory, like say next summer, he could be an expiring, like a 35.5 million. And I'm not saying he's like he's so bad, he's just an expiring. I just mean
Right.
it from the perspective of that may be more valuable to other teams than say like a Jeremy Grant, who's got 3 years after this year,
Oh god.
including a $36 million player option in 2027, 2028, which we know he will pick up, like no matter what, because he'll be
Yep.
what, like 34 or so by the end of
Yeah.
that. So
He's
I mean,
30 right now.
yeah, so yeah, that's wild. But either way, um, That's why I probably wouldn't have Grant like in the top 3 of
I
like,
can't.
value, but I think like he is a guy that I think you would like to trade just because it's like you don't really need him on this team cuz
Yeah, but that
let's say
contract hurts though.
yeah, cuz he's the only guy on this roster that's going to get minutes that is 30. And so that's where, 2 seasons from now, when everybody else is still in their earlier mid 20s, he's 32, 33. And, Portland probably is still going to be a mediocre team if that's going to be, the guys that are taking up the majority of your cap space. So, they have guys, but I just think they should probably should move on from some of them. What about a guy like a Duop Reith, who's like
Mm.
28 and
Mm.
he played a decent amount like as a backup big, but could that be a guy where like even though he's gonna only be like in his second season, he is on a 3-year deal and it's a very inexpensive contract, and you wonder like, is there a team that could be like, we need a backup big man. There's very few guys on the market. Maybe we could, deal like a very small contract and like a second or something like that for this guy, or is it just kind of like nobody should want to trade for him? Because last year he played as like a stretch five kind of that had some, I guess, shot blocking capabilities, but also Portland was such a bizarre team. How much stock do you really take into that versus what would he actually look like, playing minutes for like a decent team? I don't know. But I just know that there are teams where it looks like clearly that they need some type of help at that, you know, big man spot. And even though he's like a little undersized, right? What is he like 6'9"? I mean, it's still probably better than, you know, what some of these teams have because some of these teams don't really have any options at all at the
Yeah,
five.
I would agree. I could see him being, a guy that like his value probably goes up around the deadline. I think he's probably a guy that gets traded around the deadline to a
Hmm.
team that probably has no center. Like I don't know, maybe New Orleans, but um, you know that has kind of piqued my interest as well because they do have like depth pieces, but they're not
Right.
good depth pieces on a team like this.
Right.
It'd
Yeah.
be
Like
different,
even
like if they're a depth piece on a championship roster, green light, but they shouldn't be depth pieces here, if that
right.
makes sense.
Yeah, because even a guy like a Matisse Thybulle, right, like just doesn't really like. Even though he is a good defender, right, he doesn't really have a place on this team because you don't really have enough, like good offense on this team to really make up for what he's not going to give you on
No,
the offense,
not at all.
right? Like on a team that is a high level offensive team, right? Maybe you can make up for that there, but on a team like this, it's going to be probably a little bit, not that he's not going to play at all, but it's just a little bit tougher because again, like, they're going to they have guys that can score, but Portland's not going to be a top 10 offensive team. Like last season, what were they, 29th in offensive rating? And I mean, to be fair, some of that's just because a bunch of guys didn't play. But even when they did, like, I mean, this wouldn't be an above average offensive team. They wouldn't be good enough.
Yeah, yeah, but they do have some young pieces that I think could be deadline guys, or maybe even look a little better, like Delano Banton. I know he didn't play like a crazy amount of the season, played 30 games, but he averaged 16. So
Right. Yeah, exactly. And again, that's the thing about this team where you understand that, like, they didn't need to do a lot this offseason just because, they did so much last offseason. So you kind of expected more of a, not like demure, but like just more of like an offseason where they weren't going to do as much. But
mhm.
then you still kind of left wondering, like, man, like they still need to move some of these guys because the roster just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense,
Yeah.
right now. But again, at the same time, they're not trying to win a ton of basketball games. So
Mm-mm.
I mean, this is still a very much a rebuilding team. I mean, this is one of the only teams in the Western Conference that's probably not going to look to really win a ton of games at all. I mean, which because again, I mean about I mean, how many? Like 12 teams or so in the Western Conference. You can easily make the case that they're going to try to win. Now, not all of them are going to win games, but most of them going into the season are going to at least try to win
Yeah, they
games,
have
right?
that
Even a
goal.
team like, yeah, exactly. Even a team, like the Spurs, right? Like there's going to try to win games. I don't know how many they'll actually win. Some of that might be, we already talked about it, right? In our Spurs offseason video, if you haven't already looked at that, right? Some of that will be based off of what does Wemby look like. But, again, Portland is not one of those teams. They're not at that point yet. So we still don't, like you honestly kind of alluded to, we still don't even know quite yet if Scoot, is, the franchise guy on this team because he
Yeah.
hasn't, he didn't show it last year, but maybe he shows that this year, but we just don't know, right? Because like we already know Wemby's a franchise guy for the Spurs, right?
Yeah,
You know,
you're
we
right.
already know a guy like Apollo. Again, different situation, but we already know like that's a franchise guy for
I would even
Orlando.
say like Brandon Miller if we're being real, you know.
Sure. But we just don't necessarily quite know that for Scoot yet. But it was a good sign that he was improving as the year went on. So hopefully
Sure.
that bodes well for this
And
season. It's just going to be a bizarre team in terms of I'm curious to see how they're able to kind of handle all the different, you know, rotational pieces where it's a lot of redundancy at certain positions, as we already said. A lot of guards and bigs.
yeah, and another thing about Scoot, I know we saw him in person in the summer league for
Yeah.
like what, like 2 quarters or
One
something
game.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, like one game, half a
So,
game or something like
yeah. So, granted that's all I've seen of him IRL, but
that. Hmm.
on TV in the very few Portland games that I did watch when he was playing, he's
Hmm.
a lot smaller than I realized.
Hmm.
Like in terms of like height. So, I
Yeah,
don't
he's
know
like
if that might
6'2".
that might actually be a big hindrance if we're being real. I thought he was like 6'3", but he looks more 6'1" to me. So, that might
Yeah.
translate to why he might be having some of these issues, but I don't know.
Yeah, and like to be fair, that is kind of a difference between, like say high school, versus, college. I know he went to the G League Ignite,
Oh
that's a
God.
story for another day, but either way, there's a big difference between all those levels because at
Hmm.
the NBA level, like obviously there's not like a lot of guys with Scoot's build, but there are a lot of players in the NBA that are just bigger, stronger, more athletic and more physical. I mean, like even a guy like a Zion, right? Like there are times where, he looked unstoppable in like high school or college. And I'm not saying he's not an unstoppable
Sure,
guy.
sure.
I just meant like at the NBA level, there are guys that can match up with him a little bit better, than at the lower levels, which is kind of what you expect because the NBA is the highest level of competition. And so for a guy like a Scoot, right? He was, probably used to being the biggest guard on the floor, right? Like by and large when he was playing up until the NBA. But now in the NBA, I mean, you got guys that are playing point guard and they're like 6'5", 6'6". I mean, like Luka is a massive, basically guard
Yeah.
type guy. So I mean, even a guy like a Drew Holiday who doesn't have anywhere near the level of athleticism as a Scoot Henderson, but he's a big, strong, physical guard. So
Yeah.
that's where he's probably going to have to again figure out how to adjust and transition to the everything that the NBA is throwing at him. So I think he can do it. It's just a matter of is this roster kind of the best way for him to succeed as of right now. It's nice that you do have other ball handlers and creators, so it's not like you're asking him to do every single thing on the fly, but it still kind of is a weird cluster of a bunch of different players. So that's where, in some ways I could see it being a positive, but in other ways it might be a little bit of a negative, but we'll have
Yeah.
to see.
Because like like I feel like he's what 6'2".
Yeah, and he doesn't have the same level of like muscle as Scoot.
No, he's a
He's a
generational
pretty
athlete. Like
yeah.
so, and it's funny because when people were scouting and even us like talking about Scoot,
Hmm.
freak athlete, but I don't know. I don't know. Maybe everyone was wrong, but I don't know. I could be delving
Yeah.
into something that's too early to tell. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where like we do have to give it some time. It's just
Yeah.
kind of it's a little bit disappointing if you were really high on Scoot and then you
Yeah.
almost feel like you got gamed,
Yeah,
by the
it's
G League
bad, bro.
Ignite.
It's
But at
bad.
the same yeah, but at the same time, like I'm not, gonna completely you can't write off a guy after 1 year, especially on a team that underwent like a lot of change in a very short amount of time.
That's
So I
fair.
mean, that's where it's like, that's where it's like I'm very empathetic to, what happened with that rookie season. So it's
Yeah.
like I'm hopeful that he can kind of put some stuff together, more consistently this time around. But, we'll have to see
100%.
because
Yeah.
I'd be a little bit more concerned, like you said, if it's year two and he's still kind of having some similar issues and it doesn't really feel like there's any real growth at all, that's where I would start to kind of get worried. Because even though
Yeah.
the team is still pretty similar to last year, I mean, like just in theory, just having another year of experience in the NBA should just make you better.
Yeah, and the off-season workouts, all that stuff. So we'll see. Hopefully it all translates. Because I'm not trying to make it seem like I'm like hating on him and harping on it, but I'm just trying to think like because we didn't really talk about Portland a whole lot last year. There wasn't a whole lot to talk about. The last time we
No.
probably talked about them was Scoot's woes whenever there was a trade or their
Yeah.
off-season breakdown. Like that's the last time I can remember. So I'm just trying to recall, as to why his rookie season probably didn't go the way it was
Right.
expected to, I
So
guess.
right, yeah, and I'm hopeful that he can have a better,
Yeah, yeah.
a more
Facts.
consistent year, and I think he will.
Yeah,
So I'm not ready to sound the alarms yet,
yeah,
but
yeah. Close.
the over under for Portland is 22.5, which what do we think of that? Last year they were 21-61,
Mm.
so basically, literally just one more win.
Mm, mm, mm. I'm
That's a
I'm
tough one.
I'm tempted to go under. I really am.
Okay.
Um, but at the same time, did they get that much worse? I feel like they might go over
Mhm.
because it all depends on health.
Yeah. I
You
feel like
know,
they got better.
yeah,
It's just a matter of like how much better will that actually translate to wins? But I think, like you said, it depends on the health of players. And if, like, say, is Scoot actually good? Because if he's actually good
yeah,
consistently, that should add on at least like two more wins. But
yeah.
I don't expect them to hit more than like 25 because of the fact that, like, I expect them to still be a bad team because they still don't have like a lot of high end talent, even though they have a lot of like solid NBA players. But
I'm
I
gonna
don't
go
really
under.
see that.
I'm going under.
You're going to go under?
I'm gonna take the under. Yeah, because I think the team is gonna look different by the deadline.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go under as well.
Under.
Also
Okay.
because I feel like the West got better,
Yeah, that
like,
too.
and it got better than they did. So, like, say, like Memphis will be better,
Mm-hmm.
the Spurs will be better,
Mm-hmm.
even the teams that we didn't really love what they did in the offseason, like they'll still be better than Portland, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, say even if you didn't like LA or Golden State or some of these others, even if you didn't love what they did or feel like they didn't do a lot, they'll be better than Portland. So I
Yeah,
mean,
agreed. Yeah.
so that's where the combination of that, I think, will probably make their record probably not much different. I mean, like you
Yeah.
said, it could just honestly just be worse because they're in the stronger, well, not stronger, but like they're in the deeper conference, and they're gonna have to
It's
play all
stronger.
those teams. Yeah, but
We
like
had
you
it
know what I
right the
mean.
first
Like,
time. Yeah.
yeah, just from the perspective of like, there's a lot more good teams in the West, so they're gonna have to play all those teams at least 3 or 4 times.
Yep.
So that's where I'm not really high on their ability to win a lot of games. I mean, like, I wasn't really last year. Like, I could at least understand the thought process of them being better. It's just like the West is better, and they shouldn't really want to be good this year because, like, who have we really established at this point for Portland where it's like, all right, we're ready to completely build around this guy and take the next step? Like, you're not ready yet. You still
No.
like, you have some guys in the core, but we don't know if all those guys will be real future pieces or
Yeah.
not. Because
You're right. Yeah.
and like you said, the other element of they could be one of the more active teams at the deadline where they're just a big seller because they do
Yeah.
have players that I think a lot of teams would want. I actually think it would be almost kind of like malpractice if they didn't do it,
They
unless
have
there's
to.
like just absolutely like nothing out there. Like, say, like if nobody's willing to give up anything for anyone, but I feel like at least somebody's gonna bite on a couple of these players.
Yeah.
Like, I
100%.
could see somebody like, unless Robert Williams is just broken,
Yeah. Hurt
I could
again.
see somebody like talking themselves into trading for him because his contract is so solid, and then even a guy like a Matisse Thybulle, but some other guys like say like a Jeremy Grant,
No.
I would expect him to be on Portland probably for the rest of the year. I don't
Probably
see a
even
team.
Aiton too.
Yeah, because I don't really see anybody trading for those guys, and again, that's still going to cause some clutters in the rotation, but it's also just very difficult to trade all of those players in one swoop. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to do
Yep.
that because you have to open up the roster spots. You got to find the other teams willing to take them on. But I think at least a couple of those guys. So
Yeah.
I guess ultimately, so are we kind of going like, are we basically saying like yes to at least a couple guys on the roster and then which guys to be moved?
Yeah. I would go with Robert Williams. That's why I had him
Okay.
ranked number one. I'm
Yeah.
probably going Robert Williams and maybe Simons, but
Okay.
that might be a little bit of wishful thinking because it might be too early for Simons to get moved, but
Yeah.
definitely
I'm
another
thinking
role player.
yeah, I'm thinking probably Robert Williams and one of either Matisse Thybulle or Reith. Like, I could
Yeah, that
just see
makes
one of
sense.
those guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like you said, I wouldn't expect Aiton to be moved, and I definitely
No.
wouldn't expect Grant to be moved. Like,
No.
there might like I don't see a team that's gonna be desperate enough to do it. Maybe there will be a team desperate enough to do it, but I'd be a little bit surprised. And it's not even like Jeremy Grant is bad. It's just whatever team is desperate enough to deal for him, I just don't know if it's worth doing what you have to do. Like, say
Yeah.
we've talked about it with a team like the Lakers, doesn't really make any real sense to trade for Jeremy Grant because you're
Right.
going to be giving up decent players for one guy, and it's not a guy that's necessarily a game changer. Not that that means you shouldn't do anything. It's just, you know, like it's not like the year with Westbrook where you dealt one guy that wasn't, that you wanted to get rid of and got brought in a bunch of players. You're trying to trade for one guy by dealing out multiple players. So we'll see,
Yeah.
who knows? Because what was it like? We were on what was it? Top Notch Takes with Trent, right? His
Yeah.
podcast, and he had that question about like should the Mavs trade for Jeremy Grant, and it was like it's probably a good thing they didn't do that
100%.
because
Yeah.
it would have been a lot more difficult to do what they were able to do.
Yeah. They wouldn't have done it, in my opinion.
Yeah. So moving on, around the NBA, we do have a few things to discuss. So Trey Murphy, according to Shams Charania, he has suffered a right hamstring strain, so he's going to miss at least 3 weeks. So that's unfortunate. I guess it's kind of a good thing that they didn't trade Brandon Ingram away, but it's still, because you wouldn't otherwise you'd be missing out on a wing. But at the same time, not good because he is one of their more important players and he's one of their best 3-point shooters, if not their best 3-point shooter. Also very high volume, can shoot from range, and he's a long athlete and he kind of helps out in some of those other lineups where, you want a guy out there to spread the floor with Zion. Just because you want to give Zion the room to attack. So it's a loss for sure, right? Like I'm not gonna say like it's a season ender for New Orleans, but for a team that's already having issues in regards to keeping their main guys healthy, right? That's not a good sign. And it's also rough for him because he's looking for an extension at some point. So that's not ideal because at least 3 weeks basically puts him right at the beginning of the season where he probably won't play early in the season.
Yeah. Crazy story. It's definitely a bad start to the season already and hasn't even started yet. But yeah, like you said, he's one of the more elite 3-and-D wings in the league. So definitely a big loss for them. So, yeah, like you said, good thing that they didn't trade Brandon Ingram yet, potentially, but it sucks because that could be an injury that lingers too and could be easily be re-aggravated. So,
Yeah, exactly. Because that's the rough part. Is just that the hamstring is like the ankle, where you kind of have to, where you do have to take it, really seriously. Not that you
mhm,
wouldn't take an injury seriously, but
yeah,
just from the perspective of you just have to be really careful because if you hurt your hamstring again, then you're going to be out for even longer. So
yeah,
you got to watch
exactly.
out for stuff like that. But
Yeah,
just rough. And speaking of hamstrings again, it sounds like that Jaren Jackson Jr.'s got some type of hamstring injury. Now they didn't they didn't seem like they were as you know I guess distraught about it. So
right.
hopefully that means that he won't really have to miss any significant time. But it's still not a good thing for Memphis because that's a guy that you need out there, and it's a team that had horrible injury luck last year. Actually, it was the opposite of luck. So that's already not good to have one of your key guys miss time when you're already going to be down a couple other players, even though they're not as important. But it's still rough.
Yeah, another bad start. Kind of similar to New Orleans, considering that they had trouble staying healthy last year, like you said, Memphis that is. So and he's a key piece, but maybe not saying that it opens up a crazy amount of minutes, but maybe Zach Edey gets some more minutes, Brandon Clark as well. So I'm curious, what that's gonna look like.
Exactly. Yes. And then also since the last time that we recorded,
Mm-hmm.
the big Knicks Minnesota Wolves trade has been completed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only stuff that was kind of adjusted was that Daquan Jeffries, he was in the deal going to Charlotte. Charlie Brown Jr. from the Knicks going to Charlotte, as well as Dwayne Washington Jr. going to Charlotte. And then James Najee from Charlotte is going to the Knicks. And that was really the only thing that changed. But actually, kind of a cool loophole that the Knicks were able to pull off where normally you can't aggregate minimum contracts, but they were able to give those three guys that I mentioned, Jeffries, Brown, and Washington, they gave those guys a little bit more than a minimum, so they were able to aggregate them into the deal in order to open up the roster spots and I guess create whatever opportunity they needed in order to pull off the deal. So pretty savvy move by the Knicks front office. And we already talked about the trade, obviously. So if you want to know our full thoughts, You can check out the previous episode of, that's kind of focusing on the Minnesota offseason, but also in the beginning we talked about that trade. So
Yeah, I mean, overall, um, it's kind of cool. It's like a little cherry on top, I guess, and that might be something that other teams try and integrate as well with the new CBA, because we're probably going to be seeing, and we already have seen teams move very differently since that CBA has been introduced. So, shout out to the Knicks for being able to, kind of swindle their way through that one.
yeah. And then last but not least, just to mention Media Day, right? Obviously had already started last week, right? So if you're watching this, you're watching this, on Friday, but it started, I guess, Monday, but then you had the other two teams, Boston and Denver, do it earlier in the week, right? But it went through, and what did you kind of think of it, right? Because obviously, like when you look at Media Day, there's always kind of things that you're going to hear, right? Like guys are going to say, I'm in the best shape I've ever been, or I've put on X amount of, muscle, or I've lost, X amount of weight, or, things like that. And, what were, I guess some standout Media Day moments that you kind of witnessed? Because I guess, there were a couple of cool ones, right? I guess you had LeBron and his son. And then you also had a couple of funny ones, right? Where it was like, I think Embiid had mentioned like, yeah, I still got a ways to go, but I'm losing some weight, and we're gonna load manage some of this stuff. And then, you also had, I guess, a couple scenarios where like, a guy like a Zach LaVine, you can kind of tell like, if you saw the picture with him and Vucevic, like they don't really want to be there, even though I'm sure they're gonna play a good soldier, but just kind of the usual stuff that you kind of anticipate. But what did you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was one of the more expressive media days that I've kind of paid attention to. A lot of people making fashion statements. Like you said, the Bronny one with LeBron was awesome. Them doing their handshake, the banter, all that stuff. I think everybody's a huge fan of that. Um, the one that I'm kind of hyped about is Wemby. 20 pounds is no joke, if that's accurate. That makes him very scary. Zion, he looked pretty in shape. I think the actions have spoken louder than the words with that one. So that might be, a case of we need to watch out for Zion this year. And yeah, overall, I think a cool thing was seeing all the rookies too. I think the rookies are always a huge highlight for media day for me, because I like to see, their dreams being, playing out in real life is pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the cool, thing to see. Also, some other strange ones. I guess you had the Clippers one, right? Where I think, Kawhi, you know, basically just, mentioned like, I'm gonna try to play, and we'll see what happens from there. But I don't know. Of course, media day is always kind of, it's usually supposed to be the quote unquote most optimistic day for a lot of teams. Obviously, for some teams, the most optimistic day will be, like say for Boston winning the title, right? But even for teams that probably aren't going to be that great, right? That's always kind of the moment where everything's positive. There's very few negatives. Like, even a team like the Lakers, right? Where right now it seems like the vibes are, I guess, better than last year because I guess they're rid of Darvin Ham.
Hmm.
But of course, it's very hard to have really negative vibes going into a training camp unless it's like a team of guys that just absolutely despise one another, which I think it's been a little bit of time since we've seen that. And then also Jimmy Butler, right, where he came into media day and
Normal.
didn't have any, changes. He just came in normal, right? I guess he talked about it being a contract year, which is something we kind of talked about when we did our Heat off-season look. And we kind of mentioned the idea of like, yeah, contract year Jimmy Butler. What does that look like? Does this mean the Heat are going to take next season, specifically him, seriously? Who knows? So that could be something
Yeah.
positive, but who knows?
Another thing about media day, it's very scary. Is seeing how long some of these guys have been in the league already, and they're
Yeah,
very young. Like I think what Book is year 10,
yeah. It's
which
like,
is
wow, it's been that
crazy.
long.
Yeah, Ja I think is what 6 or something like that.
Yeah,
It's like it feels like year 2 for some of these guys,
yeah.
But
And then
that's
you have
another
the
thing.
guys. And then you have the guys that have been in the league for, even longer, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like, they'll post the comparisons of what they looked like maybe like at their
yeah.
earliest media days. Like LeBron, this is what, year 22
22,
or whatever.
22.
Yeah. Yeah, for Harden it's 16. I think for Steph it's like 16. So just Yeah, just for what is it? Isn't Durant? I think it's like 18 or something
Mm-hmm.
like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, kind of wild how we've gotten to that point, with all these guys. But
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
media day is
insane.
always kind of cool, and sometimes you kind of have to read between the lines. But again, like it's usually fun. But
Yeah.
it is always kind of interesting how that's what kicks off the season
Mm-hmm.
usually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and now that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. By the time this episode comes out, we'll have already had one preseason game, right? That's the Celtics and the Denver Nuggets, right? They play at noon Eastern time. And the reason why they're playing at that time is because they're in Abu Dhabi. That's why their media days were first, right? A week ago or whatever. And then after that, we're gonna have another preseason game. I want to say around 10:30 Eastern time PM, between the Lakers and the new look Minnesota Timberwolves. So hope obviously that's kind of the cool point is that basketball is here basically. We're in the preseason. We're not going to try to take too much into preseason just because of the fact that you know when you do that, you always have to take it with a grain of salt because there's always going to be moments where you look at something and then you're going to get fooled, and then it could be something or it could mean absolutely nothing because that
Same
happened a
thing as
lot
summer
last
league,
year.
man. Same thing as summer league.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's a little bit different from summer league just because the level of competition is higher, but at the same time you still have to be very careful with it. But it's always good to have basketball back, which means that we're only a couple weeks away basically from the real NBA season starting. So obviously as the NBA season kicks off, we're going to continue to put out content for everybody. So continue to like, comment, and subscribe. So hopefully everybody enjoys the NBA season with us, right? Because we're almost here. So we'll see you in the next episode.